Thank you everyone once again for having taken the time to be present at this webinar today. It's truly a pleasure to be speaking with all of you. I have a small introduction which I've built into one of the slides going forward, so I'll save my self-introduction for later. And Nidhi has done such a fabulous job of introducing me anyway, so I hope that today's presentation is something which will give you important takeaways for career growth, career development, specifically within medical writing, and also give you a glance as to some of the things which I have done earlier in my career and some of the things which other medical writers have done in order to kickstart their career within medical writing. I've structured this presentation in a way which gives you a snapshot of some do's and don'ts, specifically for those of us earlier on in our career trying to break in. And one of the interesting things about this talk is that it's based on conversations that I've had with people who are making a transition into medical writing. So anytime I have an opportunity to pause and share a story about someone who went through a certain experience and who learned something important, which has made it into this presentation, I'll certainly go into that story as well to give you some insight as to how you can leverage your own situation, how you can leverage your own strengths to break into medical writing. And in case anyone is wondering, those lights behind me is because I'm just preparing the house for Diwali coming up. So as an outline for today's presentation, we'll talk about the need for medical writing. An important question to ask before we begin any discussion is, why should the discussion take place to begin with? So let's briefly touch upon why we need medical writing, followed by a brief self-introduction of my entry into the medical writing world, followed by a high-level overview of the description of the different flavors of medical writing. This is important to discuss because, as many of you already know, medical writing is not just one job. It's used as an umbrella term to describe different types of writing. So we'll go over some of the most common types of medical writing. We'll talk about the first steps that anyone needs to take to break in and some considerations to keep in mind while breaking into medical writing. And finally, again, a high-level overview of deliverables, which is an industry term for the kinds of documents that medical writers write, and briefly touching upon new frontiers, new and upcoming fields within medical writing, which are now gaining traction and gaining attention from within the medical writing community. So without further ado, let's begin. So why do we need medical writing to begin with? To address this question, I have put within quotes something which was shared with me from someone who's been in the medical writing community for over 20 years. This person is obviously very experienced and is now owner of a company that specializes in regulatory medical writing. And he had said to me, medical writing is the backbone of clinical development. And I find this quite illuminating and insightful because think about the analogy. When you see a person, you just see them from the outside, you don't see their backbone. The same is true of a successful clinical development program. The same is true of a successful therapy or a device or a medication or a treatment option, which is out there and changing lives and improving health and doing these amazing things. We don't see the medical writing which has gone into it. It's like the backbone of clinical development. We don't see it, but without it, the program cannot sustain itself. So that gives us a snapshot of how important medical writing really is. Medical writing is something which plays a role in clinical development from beginning to end. And that is illustrated with this schematic here. During the early phase, medical writers communicate with regulatory agencies, as well as prepare documents for investigators who are actually treating patients in clinical trials. During later phases, medical writers also develop documents for care providers, as well as patients when therapies have become successful and patients are taking these therapies. And once a product has been launched, once a clinical trial has concluded, the product has been launched. It's out there in the world. It's now for public consumption. Medical writers are also involved in developing documents for payers and patients. Payers meaning healthcare companies as well as health insurance companies, as well as regulatory agencies, because the regulatory agency not only wants to know what's going on with the drug before it's approved, but also wants to get an idea of what's going on with the drug after it's approved in terms of safety, in terms of quality of life, and whether or not the drug is able to reduce healthcare utilization, whether or not the drug is able to be efficacious outside of the clinical trial in the real world, as since it was efficacious within the clinical trial. Moving on to an overview of how I entered the medical writing world. Before I get into the story, I want to emphasize that my entry into medical writing um, is not something that I would consider a unique story, because when I speak with other medical writers and find out about their stories and find out about their entry points into medical writing, there are just so many commonalities between my story and theirs, so many regions of overlap and points of intersection, that this could really be anyone's story. So with that said, let me just describe what really happened. So the first step was I had a stroke of insight in when I was working toward my PhD in immunology. I realized that communicating science for a living is something that people do day in and day out, and I had no idea how big the world of science communication was. And this is something which I truly found interesting because I've always enjoyed communicating science, and even when I was training as a scientist doing bench work most of the time, the communication aspect of science is something which intrigued me and inspired me and made me feel a sense of fulfillment when I would communicate science to someone. So when I found out that people actually communicate science day in and day out and make a living out of it, I was just fascinated that something like this really exists. And that is the initial thought, the very first thought, which got me interested in learning more about the field of science communication as well as the field of medical writing. And as I was researching and learning more about medical writing, I reflected upon something which one of my coaches used to say many years ago, which is you have to play to your strengths. Um, just like me, there are many people out there who are in a certain academic path who might be at a crossroads, just like I was at a crossroads where I had to determine between going and pursuing a career in research and development versus branching off into science communication. It was daunting. It was scary. There were just so many uncertainties because I had spent so much time developing my strengths to be in an R&D role. And now all of a sudden, I was seriously considering branching off into a science communication role. So it was daunting nonetheless. But I kept reflecting upon this statement where my coach used to say, play to your strengths. Let someone else worry about your weaknesses. Your goal is really to play to your strengths. So I thought, let me play to my strengths and follow my passion for science communication. So in order to follow this passion, I began having conversations and as well as thinking more strongly and introspecting about building a career in science communication, specifically in medical writing. And I spoke with many medical writers, I spoke with science writers, I spoke with scientific editors, um, and science journalists. And the result of all these conversations was that it helped me set my goal. It helped me build a sense of reassurance that I truly wanted to transition into medical writing. When I had decided that I wanted to transition to medical writing, the next question was what specific type of medical writing? As I had mentioned earlier, the eye-opening moment for anyone who has just recently discovered the world of medical writing is that it's not just one thing. There are so many different flavors, and it's important to consider which flavor of medical writer inspires us most, which flavor of medical writing strikes a chord with us, something that we can relate to. And also, it's important to ask who we want to write for, because every different type of medical writing is specifically designed to cater to the needs of a specific audience. Here are some common and most often practiced flavors of medical writing. There's regulatory medical writing, where the audience is mostly regulatory agencies such as the US FDA, the EMA, regulatory agencies in Canada and Japan. And every country has a regulatory agency that needs to look at a clinical study protocol or a clinical study report and approve that document before a clinical trial can take place. So the writing needs to be adjusted to suit the needs of the audience. And then there's medical communication, which is writing for other scientists, writing for healthcare professionals, medical doctors. There's continuing medical education, which is medical writing with an educational slant. This is mostly written for medical doctors and healthcare providers. There's health communication, which is medical writing for people with a non-science background or people with not so much of an advanced science background. This comes closest to writing for a general audience. There's promotional medical writing, which again is writing for healthcare providers, anyone who can prescribe medications, medical writing for medical science liaisons, people who work within medical affairs, use deliverables based on promotional medical writing to speak with healthcare providers and let them know about the new and upcoming therapy options which are out there. And of course, the most exciting part is new frontiers in medical writing. I'd like to emphasize that this field is still quite young compared to some of the other fields within clinical research, and it's rapidly growing, and it's a very exciting time to enter medical writing. And as the title of this slide suggests, there's something for everyone. I haven't summarized all the available flavors of medical writing, just the most commonly practiced ones. But I do want to emphasize that there's something for everyone. So keep looking and find something which resonates with you, which inspires you, because doing work which you find fulfilling is something which is really going to make you successful. Many of us tend to assume that we are in control of performance and success. That's not true. We are neither in control of performance or success. We are only in control of finding ways of taking small steps toward work which we find inspiring. As long as we find work which is inspiring, success and good performance comes naturally. So let's talk about some very first steps in breaking in. Before I begin describing this, I want to remind all listeners that this is based not only on personal experience, but also on one-on-one conversations which I've had with other medical writers, as well as working with medical writers in small groups and helping people break into medical writing. So the content which I'm about to present is really based on people's experience in the job market. And that's how I know that it's going to work, because people say that, failure is a stepping stone to success. And that's absolutely true. Every single bullet point, every single bullet point presented here has a story of trial, a story of failure, and a story of success behind it. The most frequently asked question that I get is, what should I be doing first? People say, I want to break into medical writing, but I'm not certain what I should be doing first. There are three things to consider in answering this question. The first is analyze, which is self-analysis, building self-awareness, getting a sense of what type of medical writing interests us most. The second step is to align. Once we have settled, or once we have at least decided on the type of medical writing which interests us, we begin the process of alignment, aligning any experience we might have had or aligning any skills we might have with the opportunity that we really want to attract in our lives. And the third is to connect. Connect with people who are already in a position where you want to be. Connect with people who are in medical writing roles. Connect with people who are communicating science. It's just crucial to make that connect and keep building upon that connect. All three steps have very, very important roles in making the transition happen. And these words are sequenced in a way which helps us understand how we need to reshape our thinking process in order to make this transition happen. Because if we begin connecting people without conducting a self-analysis or without building self-awareness and without aligning our skills and knowledge with what we want to achieve, then the purpose of that connect loses focus. We can speak with someone for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or perhaps even an hour, and nothing might come out of that conversation if we haven't taken time to build awareness first and to make alignments first. And so it's really important to understand that this uh, word sequence here is not just a random word sequence. It describes a sequence of events which we need to consider carefully and implement carefully in order to make the transition happen. So talking about analysis and building awareness, I'd like to share an exercise called the knowledge gap analysis. In order to make a transition from point A to point B, point A is where we are right now in our lives. Point B is the medical writing job that we'd like to get. It involves three steps. First is building awareness, building knowledge, and building skills. The last step here, building skills, is grayed out because that's not something which is under our control at the moment. And I say that this is not under our control at the moment because in 90% of the cases, 9 out of 10 times when I speak with medical writers, they say that the skills required to be good in the job, the skills required to perform the job effectively is learned only when you start working, only on the job. It's the on the job experience which is the most helpful and most effective in helping people perform well and become successful. And reflecting on my personal experience, this is absolutely true. Most of the learning happens when you're on the job itself. However, it's also important to consider that there's so much that we can do before breaking into medical writing, before actually getting that first full-time offer, which is building awareness and building knowledge. And that's something we are a little bit more in control of. And today I'd like to present an exercise which has been extremely helpful for me, as well as other medical writers who are in this process of transitioning into medical writing. So the knowledge gap analysis really has three steps. The first step is to look at job descriptions for the type of medical writing role that we really want to get into. I know that it's just a simple word. It says job description search, but it takes a lot of effort to really sit down and think about what area of medical writing they want to break into, and then do a search of job descriptions within that specific role. And this is important because it helps us get an idea of what the requirements are. It helps us get an idea of how close or how far away we are from making that breakthrough of moving from point A to point B. So to give you an example, if I am someone who didn't have any medical writing experience and I wanted to break in to, let's say, health communication, then I would look up, let's say, somewhere between 7 to 10 job descriptions which have a very heavy health communication focus. It doesn't matter where these job descriptions are coming from. It doesn't matter if the roles are located within your neighborhood, within your city, or even within your country. You can just conduct a job description search, which can just be global. The main point is that it has to be a job which you find inspiring and something which you can see yourself doing. And you're going to repeat this process of finding the job description 7 to 10 times. So what you have at the end is 7 to 10 job descriptions of roles which you find extremely interesting, which are aligned with a specific genre of medical writing that you want to break into. So going back to the example of me wanting to break into health communication, what I would do next is copy all those job descriptions and paste them into a single document. So what I end up having is a large Word document with 7 to 10 health communication job descriptions. And then I begin marking them up and highlighting them, highlighting those bullet points green, where I have direct experience, highlighting those bullet points yellow, where I have indirect experience, and highlighting those bullet points red, where I have no experience. So the purpose of this exercise is to convert that document into a landscape of how much experience I have and how close I am or how far away I am in making that transition happen. In order to give you a preview of how successful this exercise can be, I'd like to go into some testimonials and describe how people have used this exercise and how it has benefited them. Here's an interesting one from someone who didn't have a background in medical writing and didn't have a background in clinical research either. They say, for several months during the job search, I was introducing myself as a physicist with an interest in medical writing. The gap analysis taught me to introduce myself as an aspiring medical writer with a background in physics, and that changed everything. Think about how small changes in the way we communicate and small changes in the way we introduce ourselves can completely tip the conversation either to our benefit or away from our benefit. This example also brings to light the importance of adopting the identity or adopting an identity of the person we want to become before we actually become that person. So in this specific example, for several months, the person kept going to job interviews and introducing themselves as a scientist, as a physicist who is interested in medical writing. This is a fact, and it's an accurate description of oneself. However, the way the hiring manager sees it is that here is a scientist, here is a physicist who likes to do medical writing in their free time. And that's not the image that we want to portray. That's not the image that we want to project. The image that this person wanted to project was that they are committed to medical writing and they happen to have a background in science, they happen to have a background in physics. So by changing and flipping the narrative just a little bit, which again was which was a benefit which was only revealed by conducting the skill gap analysis, helped so much with the job search process. This exercise is something which seems very simple, but it's extremely helpful. Here's another interesting one. Having completed this exercise, I noticed that I was walking into interviews sounding like a full-time medical writer. Think about the value of that. Think about the value of um, the skill gap analysis and how studying the document that you have developed and marked up with all the different highlights can give you a sense of how medical writers speak with one another. It can give you a sense of the jargon and the language used in the medical writing discipline. And adopting that language and learning to use it effectively can help in interviews. And it might help us stand out as candidates who have really done the research, not only on the job, not only about the company, but also about the medical writing field in general. And that makes a huge difference because being informed, being meticulous, and doing the research are all important aspects of a medical writing role. So doing that even before we get into a medical writing role puts us one step closer to actually getting there. And here's an interesting one which specifically relates to the red highlights. The gap analysis has helped me with pinpointing my transferable skills during in-person conversations and phone conversations and provided a sense of direction with course taking during the lockdown. Many of us like to take courses. Many of us like to take um, you know, um, education which is outside the framework of the regular curriculum in order to build knowledge, in order to build awareness about where we'd like to be in the future, in order to build awareness about a specific topic, a specific subject, or even a specific technique. But one of the issues is that these days, courses are marketed so well. that we feel as if we're missing out on a huge opportunity if we don't take that specific course. So sometimes we might unintentionally overburden ourselves with taking too many courses, which need not go in a specific direction. So this is when we need to go back to the skill gap analysis and specifically focus on those red highlights and see if the course that I'm about to take, if the financial commitment and the time commitment that I'm about to make with this course is aligned with the red highlights. If the answer is yes, then we can take that course. If the answer is no, then we just tell ourselves that perhaps this course is something which might be kind of an FYI or kind of a nice to take course sometime in the future. But right now, I need to focus on the job search, and I need to be doing only those actions which takes me one step closer to where I want to be. So this kind of thinking really helps us focus. It helps us develop a sense of direction, and it helps us keep the focus in the job search process. The whole skill gap analysis from beginning to end should take not more than a week. And I say a week because it's about a 20-minute commitment each day. 20 minutes every day for a week is sufficient to do the skill gap analysis from beginning to end. One of the very interesting things about this skill gap analysis is that I have introduced this idea to people who are at the very beginning of their career. I've introduced this idea to people who are already in medical writing and trying to make a transition into a different type of medical writing. I've also talked about this idea to people who have been in the medical writing space for about 15 or 20 years. And what I find fascinating is that regardless of where a person is in their career, they are always surprised, always stunned, and it's really an eye opener for anyone, regardless of where they are in their medical writing careers. And that's something which I find truly fascinating because it's something so simple, which can just be so effective. Moving on to the next step, let's talk about connecting. Let's talk about making connections with other medical writer. Keep in mind, going back to the slide with that arrow in it, which had the three words, the first word was analyze, which is self-analysis. And we just talked about the skill gap analysis, which is so crucial for self-analysis. The second word was to align, and the third one was to connect. So let's talk about the value of connecting. As I had mentioned earlier, the medical writing field is quite young compared to some of the other fields within clinical research. And this underscores the importance of connecting and having conversations with other medical writers who are already within full-time positions or freelance positions or part-time positions. Really, in any capacity as a medical writer, it's important to speak with them. Unlike many of the other established fields, there is no checklist of things that need to be accomplished in order to get a medical writing job. When you look at some of the other very established roles, all the other roles which have been around for 30 years, 40 years, there is a certain checklist. You got to get an education in this, and then get a certification in that, and then get a license in that, and that's it. You finish the checklist, you move through the checklist, you accomplish all those tasks, and that makes you eligible, and that makes you a strong candidate for that role. In medical writing, however, there is no established checklist because people from different areas of science, people from different areas of medicine are moving into medical writing. And that's the beauty of medical writing, is the fact that there is no specific checklist that needs to be followed in order to enter the field. It's a field which harnesses the capabilities, which harnesses the strengths of people coming in from different backgrounds and uses those strengths in order to bridge the communication gap between the moving frontier of science and the general public. So one of the important things to keep in mind is the value of connecting with others. So how does connection help? It helps because it helps us engage with the community. It helps us have conversations with the community. And it's an important reminder that we also need to be following up with people we have conversations with. So let's talk about all these three steps in detail. To engage someone essentially boils down to two things. One is to prepare a reach out sentence. And I'd like the operative word there is sentence, because it takes time to gather all the experience that we have had. It takes time to think about where we are and where we want to be, and to boil that down into a sentence. And this takes time. And I often ask people, just take a piece of paper and write down the question, why do you want to become a medical writer? Or you can say, why do I want to become a medical writer? And answer that question. Some people answer this question in about 7 minutes. Some people take 7 days. Some people take much longer to answer the question. But it's important to have this question answered before beginning to engage and connect with people, because you will realize that the answer to this question is the most powerful networking tool. Because this is a question which you will get asked time and time again in conversations, in interviews, in cover letters. When you're writing a cover letter, you need to describe sooner rather than later why you want to be a medical writer. So this is a question which you can answer on your own, and you will realize that the answer is just so important in helping drive the process forward. And the second step, which is important in engaging people within the medical writing community, is to prepare a 15-second self-introduction script, which is, how would you introduce yourself in 15 seconds? Given about 15 seconds, how would you, verbally introduce yourself? You don't need to have the answer immediately, but something to think about. So having these two, having your reach out sentence and having a 15-second self-introduction script is the first things which are going to be pretty much the driving forces of what's about to come next, which is to begin having conversations with medical writers. And I have found, based on my personal experience, as well as based on working with other medical writers, that in terms of having conversations, it's extremely helpful to utilize a scheduling application. If you just go to Google and type in phone call scheduling applications, you will get dozens and dozens of absolutely free phone call scheduling applications, which you can begin using right away. Think about the number of times, or think about the back and forth messages that you have had in the past trying to schedule a phone call with someone, especially if they're in a different time zone. Think about how many messages which you have sent back and forth saying, can you meet at noon? No. Can you meet at 1? How about 1:30? How about Wednesday? How about Tuesday? What time zone are you in? Oh, I got the wrong time zone. Let's begin the conversation again. All of that can be eliminated with utilizing a scheduling application and making the process a lot smoother and a lot quicker. And of course, respect the person's time when you're speaking with them, and list out questions and talking points that you would like to ask them when you eventually schedule a conversation and get into a conversation. I have found that asking for a 15-minute commitment is something which gives a good level of response. People are willing to make a 15-minute commitment as long as you have your questions prepared. Within those 15 minutes, you can ask 3 to 4 questions. Sometimes you may not even make it past question 1, and that's okay. But 3 to 4 questions within a 15-minute mark is something that people are willing to commit to. The strange thing is that when you ask for a 30-minute commitment, people are slightly reluctant, especially people within full-time roles. When you want to make a connection via LinkedIn or via email, you ask for a 30-minute commitment, people are slightly reluctant. But when you ask for a 15-minute commitment, and at the end of those 15 minutes, you say, I know that we've reached our time commitment. It's the 15-minute mark is coming around, but I had one more question to ask you. Can I go ahead? More often than not, the person says yes, because you've already established a certain sense of momentum with the conversation. And I have lost count of the number of times when I have asked for a 15-minute commitment, begun having a conversation, and the person has given me up to 40-45 minutes of their time, because the conversation flowed. They were able to answer the questions that I was asking, and they were just happy to talk about their role. They were happy to talk about their transition, and happy to give tips and insights into what I should be doing and what I can be doing in order to make that transition happen for myself. And again, the third step is to follow up, which is to consider asking for a referral at some point. Keep in mind that the point about the referral is coming toward the end of the process. And this is often a mistake that people make when trying to break into a job. People ask for a referral very early on. So it's important to add value first before you ask for something. Always give something before you ask for something. If you're someone who, um, you know, we might ask ourselves, what can I possibly give? I don't have anything to give. You can give appreciation. You can give time. You can give effort. You can give knowledge. You can give, you can even transfer a little bit of inspiration across over the phone. It's possible. These are all little gifts that you can give to one another within the medical writing community. And once you've established some kind of a rapport, once you've had a conversation with someone, at least two conversations with someone, then there comes a time when you can ask for a referral. So here is kind of a roadmap which I like to present when people come up to me and say, how do I connect with other medical writers? How do I connect with these professionals who are working in industries, who are in a kind of role that I really want to get? Just follow these steps. Think about engagement. Think about the value of using a scheduling application if you want to have a conversation. And think about following up and having a follow-up conversation in about 2 weeks or in about 3 weeks, where you can ask questions which were missed out during the first conversation, or do a little bit of research between the first conversation and the next, and come back with more questions to ask. And again, a few testimonials about connecting with writers. One person says, I can honestly say that I was able to break into medical writing one informational interview at a time, or one conversation at a time. An informational interview is just a fancy word for conversation. If you take a conversation and approach it with strategic questions, that becomes an informational interview. And I specifically like this testimonial because when I was initially trying to break into medical writing, I had a totally different benchmark. I would say that I need to spend more time filling out applications and submitting applications to companies. And that didn't work. Filling out applications just didn't work. So I changed the benchmark and I said, instead of giving myself an application benchmark, I'm going to give myself a conversation benchmark. So instead of saying, I need to fill out 20 applications this month, I would say, I need to have 5 conversations over the next 2 weeks. That's the benchmark. And I would do everything that I could in order to reach out to people, ask them for, give them my 1-sentence reach out message. And when they would reach out, ask them for 15 minutes of their time. Be prepared with my 15-second introduction script, and be prepared with my questions that I wanted to ask them about their role, and keep the conversation focused on them. And that is something which really helped. When I changed the benchmark and went from X number of applications per month to X number of conversations per month, that's when the transition finally happened. Here's another one. Conversations with medical writer paved the way forward. I filled out the application as a formality after I had signed the job offer. And this again is not a unique story. This again is something which has happened to more than one person. This has happened to me twice in my career, where I have let conversation lead the way forward in my career path, and filled out the job application after signing the job offer, where HR has reached out to me and said, you have the job, you've signed the offer, but fill out the application just as a formality because we need to keep that filed. And this has happened to me not once, but twice in my career. This has happened with others as well in the medical writing community. Again, emphasizing the importance of having those conversations going. You might ask yourself, if having conversations is so important, then how come we don't do it more often? The answer is we don't do it more often because it's not easy. Filling out an application is a lot easier than trying to schedule a conversation and have a conversation. But in the job search process, in medical writing, as well as in any other field, the word easy is a trap. If you go for something it's easy, that means you're walking into a trap. It's only when you challenge yourself and have a conversation with people who are in positions where you want to be, um, you tend to take small but very important steps toward your goal. And going back to the point that I was talking about in terms of benchmarks, this was echoed by someone who I interviewed as well, who said, I let go of the X applications per week benchmark and adopted the X conversations per week benchmark. This shift in thinking accelerated the transition into medical writing. Okay, let's talk about some of the deliverables, some of the things that medical writers write about. Here's a snapshot of the medical writing flavor and an example of the different types of deliverables. This is not an extensive list. This information is quite easy to find online. All you have to do is to type in the word on the left, say regulatory medical writing documents or regulatory medical writing deliverables. The same is true with other genres of medical writing as well. If you say continuing medical education deliverables or health communication documents, you can easily find a list online on the different types of documents that medical writers work on. And it's kind of it's a moving list. There are some documents which would be considered the bread and butter of the role, which I've listed here. But there are also other documents which writers work on not very often, but equally important. So to briefly go through the content on this slide, in terms of regulatory, these documents, as I had mentioned earlier, is for um, an FDA audience or an EMA, which is the European Medical Writing Association audience. Excuse me, EMA is the European Medicines Agency. So INDs, investigational new drug applications, CSPs, investigative brochures, IBs, CSRs, clinical study reports. These are all regulatory documents. On the MedCom side, it's slide decks, abstracts, um, editorial letters, documents such as publications, scientific reports, and so on. And the list goes on for continuing medical education, health communication, as well as promotional medical writing. One of the points that I'd like to emphasize is that it's possible to transition from one area of medical writing to another. I began within health communication and then moved into regulatory for about 3 years. And right now I'm in the medical communication space. So when you find medical writers who transition from one field to another, or from one genre of medical writing to another, it only goes to show that strength in communication and strength in writing can really be applied across the board. And connecting using the connection roadmap, which I just showed you, and the skill gap analysis is something which has helped me out in making these transitions. When I was in the health communication space and transitioning into regulatory, I had zero regulatory experience. But the skill gap analysis helped me get a sense of all the other types of experience that I had, even though I didn't have experience within regulatory. It helped me get a sense of all the other experience that I had, which I could leverage. And I also had many, many conversations with regulatory medical writers who said, in your interview, this is how you need to be presenting yourself, or in your cover letter, this is what you need to be writing. In your resume, this is how you need to be putting points across in order to gain attention, in order to hold the attention of the hiring manager. So those kinds of insights, which I gathered from conversations, was extremely helpful. And the same thing, the same steps was repeated when I was transitioning from regulatory into medical communications, the skill gap analysis and having conversations with medical writers. So think about the value of performing those exercises. So before we wrap up, let's talk about new frontiers in medical writing, the leading edge. The quote which I'm using as the title of the slide was also something which was shared with me by a medical writer who initially began as a freelance medical writer, entered the regulatory space, began a small consulting company, which blossomed into a large consulting company, and now has many branches within the United States as well as in Germany. And this person said to me, medical writing needs to be on par with medical innovation. So medical innovation, as many of us know, is moving very quickly. And medical writing is something which needs to be absolutely on par with medical innovation, because in order to get those medical innovations to help society at large, medical writing plays a crucial role. And here are just 3 examples of the leading edge within medical writing. The first is health economics outcomes research. The purpose of this type of medical writing is to summarize the disease burden and to highlight unmet medical needs. And health economics outcomes research also talks about the economic burden that a disease could have. And it speaks to people in health insurance companies on how they need to think about funding, or think about helping people pay for certain medications, because those diseases have a severe economic burden, and those diseases are something which are um, having a huge negative impact on society in general. The second field is real world evidence. To give you a snapshot of real world evidence, when a clinical trial is conducted, it's conducted within a population of people called the clinical trial population. That population of individuals represent people who have read and signed an informed consent form, and who have understood that they have passed all the inclusion and exclusion criteria and entered the clinical trial. And the clinical trial is performed using that population of patients. However, the results of the clinical trial is not representative of what's going on with people outside the clinical trial population. So you have clinical trial evidence, which is clinical data resulting from a study which is based on that clinical trial population. And then you have real world evidence, which is results based on these people who are not in the clinical trial when it was being conducted, but who are still taking the medication for the first time. To give you an example, there is a coronavirus vaccine which is currently being developed. The clinical trial population is over 30,000 patients, and that's the trial population. But eventually, when this vaccine is approved, it's going to go out and reach a much larger population. So the efficacy results which were obtained from within the trial population could be slightly different from the efficacy which was obtained in the real world population. And comparing and contrasting those results is exactly what goes into a real world evidence report. And more regulatory agencies across the world are demanding real world evidence reports. And this has created a huge gap, a huge niche, which needs to be filled by medical writing within that space. And moving on, the third up and coming field is artificial intelligence, which is also augmented medical writing. Artificial intelligence within medical writing has some interesting applications now within the regulatory medical writing space, because within regulatory medical writing, medical writers have realized that it's possible to standardize a document. It's possible to say this document needs to have this information. It needs to have information on safety, needs to have information on dosage, administration, efficacy. It needs to have a list of adverse events. It needs to have a list of severe adverse events. So regulatory medical writers have taken all this information, and now they're teaching AI algorithms, and they're taking advantage of machine learning in order to produce documents. So they would just take study documents, they would take a protocol, for instance, and feed it to an artificial intelligence machine, and out comes a clinical study report. Out comes a document which can be just edited a little bit to make it consistent and send off to regulatory agencies. So artificial intelligence is a space where medical writers are now moving away from writing and assuming the role of a programmer who would train the artificial intelligence algorithm in order to do the writing for them. So that's another new and upcoming area of medical writing. So that concludes the point that I wanted to convey today.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Anand. It was a wonderful presentation that you put forward for our audience today, because, it not only had aspects of medical writing in it, but how to approach that field as well. As a person, Anand, I'm really, humbled by your effort to be here. And I am really grateful to you for taking out time to be with us for this webinar today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for your time in attending. If any of you have any follow-up questions which you didn't get a chance to ask now, please feel free to connect with me over LinkedIn and ask me any questions. Or if you have any questions about any of my videos, just leave a comment on the video and I'll respond to you.
Thank you so much.